She heard it through a cracked door. 3 words that unraveled 8 months of her life. The American woman means nothing. Han Do-yoon said it without hesitation, without flinching, the way a man discards something he never truly valued. And Zuri Calloway stood frozen in that hallway, one hand pressed flat against her stomach, the other still holding the dinner she'd brought him, and felt the floor shift beneath everything she thought she knew. She was pregnant with his child. She had come to tell him tonight. She never got the chance. If you have ever loved someone and discovered too late that you were the only one keeping score, this story is for you. Stay until the end. Because what Zuri does next will make you question everything you think you know about power, revenge, and who really controls the room. Before we go further, if this is your first time here, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications so you never miss a story like this one. Drop a like if you're already feeling this. And tell me in the comments, what city or country are you watching from? I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to the beginning. Zuri Calloway had not planned to fall in love in Busan. She hadn't planned on much of anything beyond her assignment. 6 months, in and out, clean the financial irregularities, write the report, go home to Charlotte. That was the job. That was the whole point. She was 32 years old, she had a reputation for being precise and unsentimental, and she had built that reputation carefully over 10 years of forensic financial work that had taken her from Atlanta to Dubai to Amsterdam and back. She didn't do messy, she didn't do complicated. She did numbers, and numbers told the truth when people wouldn't. But Busan had its own ideas about what she was going to find there. The city hit her like a wall the moment she stepped out of Gimhae Airport, humid, enormous, alive in a way she hadn't anticipated. She'd studied the files on the plane. She knew the shipping routes, the corporate entities, the names of the holding companies she'd been sent to investigate. She was prepared for the professional problem. She was not prepared for the city itself, or for the way it moved, or for the fact that 3 days into her assignment, she would sit across a conference table from a man named Han Do-yoon and feel something she couldn't immediately name. It wasn't attraction. Not exactly. Not at first. It was the feeling of being recognized. Do-yoon sat at the head of the table in a charcoal suit that fit him the way expensive things fit people who don't have to think about expense anymore. And he watched her with the kind of attention that most powerful men never bother giving a woman they don't already consider useful. He wasn't performing. He wasn't performing interest or performing respect or performing anything. He just watched and listened. And when she finished laying out the preliminary irregularities she'd identified in the shipping manifests, he said quietly, in near-perfect English, "You found the overlap in the Incheon entries." "I found 3 overlaps." Something changed in his expression. Not surprise exactly, more like recalibration. "The third one took our attorneys 6 weeks to locate," he said. "It took me 40 minutes. That was the first conversation. It lasted 11 minutes total. When it ended and the attorneys filed out and his assistant moved to usher Zuri toward the elevator, Do-yoon stood and said, not loudly, not performatively, just stated it the way someone states a fact they've already verified. "I'll review your preliminary report personally, not through counsel." His assistant looked caught off guard by that. Zuri noted it. She should have asked more questions about why. She didn't. The early weeks of her assignment were straightforward. Zuri worked long hours inside a temporary office the company had set up for her on the 23rd floor of one of the Mujin Group's legitimate hotel properties. She had full access to the documents she needed, a local liaison who answered her questions without much warmth, and a view of the Busan harbor that was objectively stunning even when she wasn't looking at it. She was professional, careful. She went where the numbers led, and she didn't let herself get distracted by the environment or the people surrounding it. The first time Do-yoon came to her office unannounced, she thought it was a power move. He walked in at 7:40 in the evening carrying 2 paper cups of convenience store coffee. The cheap kind, not the kind a man of his position would normally be caught holding, and set one on the edge of her desk without asking if she wanted it. "You missed dinner," he said. "I wasn't aware we had dinner plans." "We didn't. I'm saying you missed it, as in, you haven't eaten since noon." She looked at him. "How do you know when I last ate?" "Because I pay attention." He pulled the chair across from her desk closer and sat down without invitation. "And because my building has cameras and my assistant has eyes." It wasn't charming exactly. It was too blunt to be charming, but it was direct, honest about what it was. There was no pretense that he wasn't a man who watched things carefully. He simply didn't bother pretending. Zuri picked up the coffee cup. It was the right temperature, which meant he'd timed it. "You don't have to check on me," she said. "I know." "Then why are you here?" He was quiet for a moment, long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then, "I wanted to see how you think. You could read my reports. Reports tell me what you found. Being in the same room tells me how you found it." She set the coffee down. "That's a strange thing to say to a person you hired to investigate your finances." "I didn't hire you, your firm did. I'm choosing to find you interesting." She didn't know what to do with that, so she went back to the spreadsheet on her laptop and said, "I work better without company." He stood up. He didn't seem offended, or if he was, he didn't show it. He moved toward the door, and just before he reached it, he said, without turning around, "There's a 24-hour Pojang matcha cart 2 blocks east of the building. The fish cake soup is worth going outside for." He left. She sat there for another 45 minutes. Then she closed her laptop, got her coat, and walked 2 blocks east. The cart was exactly where he said it would be. The soup was in fact worth going outside for. She told herself it meant nothing. She told herself that a lot in those early weeks. She was wrong, but she had good reasons for trying. Do-yoon was not what she expected. She'd read enough about the Mujin organization to know what it was, or what it had been under his father. A criminal enterprise wrapped in legitimate businesses, the kind of structure that existed in many port cities around the world, built on violence and maintained through fear. The file she'd been briefed on before the assignment described Do-yoon as the third-generation head of the organization, described him as calculating and controlled, described him as someone who had moved the operation increasingly toward legitimate commercial activity without fully detaching from its criminal roots. The briefing had not described him as a man who showed up at 7:40 with cheap coffee and gave accurate restaurant recommendations. It was complicated in ways she hadn't accounted for. Over the following weeks, their conversations became a recurring thing, neither of them formally acknowledged or scheduled. He would appear. She would pretend to be annoyed. They would talk about the city, about business structures, about the particular way port economies worked, about things that had nothing to do with either of those subjects. I was better read than she'd expected, and more self-aware than men with his kind of power usually allowed themselves to be. He talked about his father without flinching, but also without nostalgia. He was honest about what the organization was and what it cost to run it, though he was careful about the specific details he offered. She noticed that, the carefulness. She also noticed that he listened when she talked, genuinely listened, not the performed listening of people who are waiting for their turn to speak. When she mentioned something small, he remembered it. When she pushed back on something he said, he didn't deflect or get defensive. He reconsidered. That was rarer than it should have been, in a man his age, in any position. By the 6th week, she knew she was in trouble. By the 8th, she had stopped pretending otherwise, at least to herself. The first time he kissed her was not cinematic. They were arguing about a property valuation discrepancy she'd found in the Guangali real estate files, standing in the hallway outside a conference room at 10 o'clock on a Wednesday night, and he had reached over mid-sentence and tucked a loose piece of her hair back from her face. Just that, just the gesture. And then they had both stopped talking at exactly the same moment. He kissed her the way a person does something they've been thinking about for a long time, carefully, like it mattered. She kissed him back. She regretted it for about 48 hours and then stopped regretting it entirely. The relationship that followed was not clean. It was not designed for easy categorization. He was who he was. She knew what his organization was and what it represented, even as he separated himself from the worst of it. She was in Korea on a professional assignment. There were 100 reasons it was complicated, and she was aware of all of them, and she stayed anyway, because the reasons to stay felt, for the first time in a long time, more real than the reasons to go. He was careful with her. That surprised her most. For all the fear he commanded in professional circles, and she saw it, the way rooms changed when he entered them, the way his lieutenants moved differently when he was present. With her, he was quiet. He asked questions more than he gave orders. He told her the truth about things, even when the truth wasn't flattering. She trusted him. That was the thing she would come back to later, in the worst hours of the nights that followed. Not that she had loved him, not that she had stayed, but that she had trusted him, completely, in a way she hadn't trusted anyone in years. 8 months in. A Thursday evening. Steady rain coming off the harbor and the city doing what it always did, humming under water and light. Zuri sat in her apartment. She'd moved out of the hotel and into a proper apartment by month 3 because she'd extended her assignment twice and she needed a kitchen, and she held a small white stick in her hands. Then 2 more because she needed to be certain. She was always certain before she acted on anything. That was who she was. All 3 said the same thing. She sat with it for a long time. Then she picked up her phone and she put it down again, because this was not the kind of news she was going to deliver over a call. She was going to do it in person. She was going to bring him the dinner he liked, the Galbi gym from the place near the harbor, the one she'd once complained was too expensive, and he'd said some things were worth expensive. And she was going to take the private elevator to his penthouse, and she was going to tell him. She was terrified. She would admit that to herself later. She was genuinely, profoundly terrified. Not because she thought he would react badly. She didn't know how he would react, and that was the thing about people you trusted. You didn't always know, and you hoped, and the hoping was the terrifying part. She had the food. She had the key card he'd given her months ago for the private elevator. She had spent an embarrassing amount of time trying to decide what she was going to say, and had finally decided she would figure it out when she got there. She stepped out of the elevator on the penthouse floor and heard voices through the gap in the door. Do-yoon's voice, his lieutenant, Park Sungjin. She had met Sungjin a dozen times. She didn't particularly like him, but she had never had a clear reason for that. She had a reason now. She heard her own name, or rather, the phrase he used for her. The American. And then she heard Do-yoon's voice, low and flat and utterly without hesitation. She means nothing. She was useful. Zuri did not move. The Yoon arrangement moves forward at the end of the month. Hae-rin's father expects an answer before the Incheon summit. The marriage was settled before this. Before any of this. It doesn't change. And the American? She goes home. She was always going to go home. The rain against the windows. The sound of the harbor somewhere far below. The weight of the takeout bag in Zuri's hand. She pressed her palm flat against her stomach, and she stood in that hallway for a long time. Long enough that she should have gone cold. Long enough that the anger should have started. It didn't start. Not yet. What she felt, and she would spend a long time understanding this later, was not rage. It was the specific, nauseating sensation of realizing that your footing was never as solid as you thought. That the ground you were standing on was always someone else's property. She had done this. She had let this happen. She, who built her entire life around understanding the structure beneath things, had failed to look closely enough at the one structure that mattered most. She looked down at her hand on her stomach. Then she turned around. She pressed the elevator button. She stepped inside and she watched the doors close, and she did not let herself fall apart until she was back on the street. In the rain, 2 blocks from the building, standing at the Pojangmacha cart where none of this had started. She didn't eat. She walked. And somewhere in the wet streets of Busan, between the harbor lights and the noise of a city that owed her nothing, Zuri Calloway began to think. She walked for 2 hours and 40 minutes. She knew because she'd checked her phone when she finally stopped, standing at the edge of a concrete pier with the harbor spread out black and glittering in front of her, rain thinning to mist now, her coat soaked through at the shoulders. 2 hours and 40 minutes. She had walked in no particular direction, taken no particular route, and ended up here, at water's edge, which felt about right. The kind of place a person ends up when they're trying to outpace something that lives inside them. She sat down on a bollard and looked at the water. Her phone had 11 missed calls. 4 from Do-yoon, 3 from his assistant, 2 from her colleague back in Charlotte who had no idea any of this was happening and didn't need to. 1 from a number she didn't recognize that turned out to be a wrong number, which struck her as almost funny. 1 from her mother, who called every Thursday without fail, because her mother was the most consistent person she had ever known, and Zuri had never once appreciated it enough until right now, sitting on a pier in the rain in South Korea, 32 years old and pregnant, and profoundly, entirely alone. She did not call any of them back. She looked at the water for a long time. Then she opened the notes app on her phone and she started writing, not feelings, not what she was going to say to him, or what she wished she had said, or any of the noise that was trying very hard to take over her head. She wrote structure, corporate entities, names of companies, holding relationships, the architecture of the Mujin Group's legitimate business operations, which she had spent 8 months mapping with the kind of thoroughness she applied to everything professionally, and which now lived in her memory with the same precision it lived in the documents she'd studied. She wrote for 40 minutes. When she finished, she read it back once. Then she closed the app and put her phone in her pocket and looked at the harbor again. She was not going to cry anymore tonight. She had done that on the walk, twice, in dark stretches between streetlights, where nobody was around to see it. And she was finished with it for now. Crying was allowed. She wasn't the kind of woman who thought it made her weak, and she wasn't going to perform being harder than she was. But she also knew herself, and she knew that grief and strategy couldn't occupy the same space at the same time. And right now she needed both, which meant she needed to be methodical about when she let each one in. Tonight had been grief. Tomorrow would be something else. She went home. She showered. She ate half a container of leftover rice because the baby needed something, even if she didn't particularly want anything. And she had decided in the 5 seconds she'd stood at the pier that whatever else happened, whatever she decided, this child was not going to be collateral damage in anything. The child was not negotiable. Everything else was. She slept 4 hours. Not good sleep. The shallow, restless kind, where you're aware of every sound, and the ceiling doesn't stop being the ceiling, but sleep. Her body demanded it. At 5:14 in the morning, she was at her desk. She opened her laptop and she went to work. The structure of the Mujin Group's legitimate holdings was genuinely complex. Zuri had spent weeks on it early in her assignment and had come away with respect for whoever had originally built it. A series of interlocking corporate entities spread across South Korea, Singapore, the Cayman Islands, and 2 shell structures in Delaware, all feeding upward into a single international holding corporation registered in Hong Kong. The Mujin Holdings International Group. The crown at the top of the tower. Every hotel, every shipping terminal, every import company, every commercial real estate property ultimately traced back to it. That was the design. And it was elegant, she had to admit. Deliberately complex at the subsidiary level to resist scrutiny, but centralized at the top, because Do-yoon's father had been a man who didn't trust distributed power. He wanted to own the whole thing from a single point. His son had inherited that structure without fundamentally changing it, because it worked, and because rebuilding it would have required exposing the connections he was trying to minimize. It was also, Zuri now understood, the single point of failure. Control Mujin Holdings International Group. Legally, documentably, through the mechanisms corporate law made available, and you controlled the legitimate heart of everything. She started building the map, not the financial map she'd already made. A different one. A map of ownership structures, shareholder agreements, voting rights, dormant clauses. The kind of map a corporate attorney would build, not a forensic analyst. She wasn't a corporate attorney, but she had worked alongside enough of them in enough countries to know the shape of what she was looking at and what questions to ask. By 9 in the morning, she had a list of questions. By 10, she had a name. Julian Okafor had a reputation in the circles that handled cross-border corporate restructuring, specifically the kind of restructuring that required knowing where bodies were buried without necessarily reporting them. He operated between Singapore, Seoul, and New York, which meant he understood all 3 legal environments. He was expensive, he was discreet, and 3 years ago, in Amsterdam, Zuri had watched him take apart a fraudulent real estate structure in 48 hours that a team of 10 had failed to crack in 4 months. She hadn't spoken to him beyond a brief professional introduction at the debrief. But she'd kept his contact information, the way she kept most things, automatically, precisely, because her brain filed useful details the way other people's filing systems filed documents. She sat at her desk for 6 minutes looking at his number. She thought about what she was doing. She was honest with herself about it. This was not a small thing. This was not venting to a friend or hiring a lawyer to send a strongly worded letter. What she was contemplating was a deliberate, calculated act of financial warfare against a man who ran a criminal organization and could respond in ways that had nothing to do with courts or corporate law. She thought about his voice through the door, the absolute flatness of it. She means nothing. She was useful, not angry, not conflicted, just flat. She picked up her phone and called Julian Okafor. He picked up on the 3rd ring, which told her he was the kind of person who answered unknown numbers. His voice was deep and measured and carried the slight British-Nigerian cadence she remembered. Okafor. Julian, this is Zuri Calloway. We met briefly in Amsterdam 3 years ago. The Vandermeer case. A short pause. I remember you. The analyst who found the Antwerp discrepancy. That's me. You're in Korea. She hadn't told him that. How do you know that? Because I follow the financial investigations that matter. What do you need? She told him. Not everything. Enough. She laid it out the way she laid out everything. Structured, sequential, stripped of emotion. She told him what she had, what she believed was legally possible, and what she needed from someone with his specific expertise to assess whether she was right. Julian was quiet for a long time after she finished. How much money do you want? He asked. None. Another pause, longer this time. Ms. Calloway, the assets you're describing are worth in the range of $300 to $400 million. When you say none, I want ownership, she said, not money, control. I was quiet again. She heard him breathing, steady, deliberate, the breath of a man rearranging his understanding of a situation. You understand what you're describing, he said. It wasn't a question exactly. I built the map. I understand it better than his attorneys do. The man whose assets you're describing is not a person who responds well to being taken from. I know. And you want to do this anyway. I want to know if it's possible, legally, without breaking a single law. She heard something shift in his voice. Not quite excitement, more like the particular focus of a person who has just been handed a problem worthy of their ability. Send me what you have, he said. I'll need 48 hours. She sent it that night, everything she had mapped. Every entity, every connection, every dormant clause she'd identified in 8 months of professional access to documents no outsider had ever been given. She hit send and then she sat back in her chair and looked at the ceiling and thought, there is no version of this that is clean. She knew that. She wasn't pretending otherwise. What she was doing had consequences she couldn't fully predict. It would change things that couldn't be unchanged. But she also knew, with the clarity that comes from a very long night and a very honest conversation with yourself, that the alternative was to leave. Leave Korea, go home to Charlotte, have her child, and spend the rest of her life knowing she had allowed a man to discard her, and done nothing because she was afraid of what doing something would cost. She wasn't built for that. She had never been built for that. She was 32 years old. She was brilliant at her job. She was pregnant and furious and heartbroken, and all three of those things were true at the same time, and none of them canceled the others out. She went to bed at midnight. She slept 5 hours this time. Better. Do-yoon noticed she was gone by the second day. This was the detail she had not fully planned for. Not that he would notice, she'd expected that. But the speed of it. He called twice the first evening, which she had expected and ignored. He sent a message through his assistant, which she also ignored. But by the following morning, he had done something she hadn't anticipated. He'd pulled the security footage from the building elevator himself. Not sent someone to pull it, done it personally. His assistant would tell her this later, in a context she hadn't anticipated. But she would piece together the timeline eventually, the way she pieced together everything, carefully, precisely, with attention to the details other people missed. What the footage showed. Zuri stepping out of the elevator on the ground floor at 9:43 p.m. Smiling. She'd been smiling. She hadn't known she was smiling, but she had been the particular smile of a woman who is terrified of good news and has decided to go deliver it anyway. Carrying the takeout bag. One hand pressed against the side of the bag, the other resting on her stomach. She wasn't thinking about cameras. She wasn't thinking about what the gesture looked like from the outside. She was just doing what she'd been doing unconsciously for 3 days since the tests. Touching that place, the way your hand goes to something new and frightening and yours. Do-yoon watched that footage and he understood. She had come to tell him something, and she had heard his conversation with Sung-jin instead. The call he made to Sung-jin at 2 in the morning was not quiet. Sung-jin had worked for the Mujin organization for 11 years. He had seen Do-yoon angry before, the cold, compressed variety, the kind that manifested as a longer silence before a decision, not raised voices. What happened at 2 in the morning was something different, Sung-jin would later describe it, in the way people describe being in the presence of something they don't have a framework for, as he was very still and very loud at the same time. You knew she was coming. Boss, the kitchen in her building orders from the same supplier as the hotel. You knew she'd placed an order for pickup. You knew the timing. I didn't think you pulled her into the conversation on purpose. Do-yoon's voice dropped. The drop was worse than the volume. You wanted her to hear it. Sung-jin didn't answer. Because you've been reporting to the Yoon family. The silence that followed lasted 11 seconds. Zuri would later learn this from a source she hadn't expected. 11 seconds, and then Sungjin said, with the particular defeated flatness of a man whose exit has just been blocked. The Yoon family needed reassurance that the arrangement was still viable. They asked me to confirm that there were no complications. She was a complication. You were attached to her. Everyone could see it. The Yoon family. You arranged for her to hear me call her nothing. His voice was very quiet now, the worst kind of quiet. You used my words to destroy something you decided I wasn't allowed to have. Sungjin started to say something about loyalty and the organization and the arrangement, and Do-yoon cut him off with a single word, just his name, said in a register Sungjin had never heard before. And then Do-yoon told him to leave. Not the room, the organization, that night, with nothing. Sungjin left. Do-yoon stood at his window and looked at the harbor and thought about a woman carrying a takeout bag and pressing one hand against her stomach and smiling before she walked into the worst moment of her life. He had 3 of his people search for her the following day. Discreetly. He was specific about that, very specific, because he understood that if she'd chosen to disappear, then showing up with muscle would be the fastest way to confirm everything she'd already concluded about him. They weren't to approach her. They were to find her and confirm she was safe, and that was the entire mandate. They found her apartment locked, her car in the garage, her office dark. She had not left the country. He checked that through channels that bypassed customs officials in ways he wasn't proud of, but he checked. She was still in Busan. She had simply stopped being visible. That frightened him in a way he didn't have clean language for. He knew what she was capable of professionally. He had known it from the first 11 minutes of the first conversation. He had given her access, real access, not the curated version he gave auditors and regulators, because he trusted her judgment, and because a part of him had wanted her to see the full architecture of what he'd built, the legitimate version of it, the version he was proud of despite everything. He had wanted her to understand it, understood now that this may have been the most consequential professional decision he had ever made. On the 3rd morning, Julian Okafor called Zuri back. She was sitting at her kitchen table with tea she hadn't drunk, and her laptop open to the same screen she'd been staring at for an hour. The tea was cold. She'd been thinking about a specific clause in the Mujin Holdings International Shareholder Agreement that she'd flagged months ago as unusual and never fully investigated because it was outside the scope of her assignment. Julian's voice when he answered was different from the first call. The measured quality was still there, but underneath it was something she recognized, the specific energy of a person who has found something extraordinary. The dormant clause, he said. You flagged it. I flagged it. Do you know what activates it? Tell me. A shareholder petition filed by any entity holding more than 12% of the primary voting stock in the event of a material breach of the fiduciary management agreement. He paused. The management agreement was signed in 2019 between Mujin Holdings International and a Singapore-based subsidiary that was subsequently absorbed into a Delaware entity in 2021. The absorption was improperly documented. There's a gap in the chain of fiduciary responsibility. Zuri closed her eyes. She had seen that gap. She had noted it and moved on because it wasn't relevant to what she'd been hired to find. Who currently holds 12% or more of the primary voting stock, she asked, though she already knew the answer. 2 entities. The first is a Hong Kong investment vehicle controlled directly by Han Do-yoon. The second is a dormant Cayman Islands trust that was established by Do-yoon's father and has had no active trustees since 2018. The trust, Julian confirmed. It requires an appointed trustee to exercise its voting rights. The appointment mechanism is a standard succession clause. Any licensed fiduciary operating under the laws of the Cayman Islands can be appointed if the original trustee position is vacant for more than 3 years, Zuri said, as of 4 months ago. Yes. The kitchen was very quiet. Her tea was still cold. The harbor was somewhere outside the window, doing what it always did. The trust's voting rights combined with shares I can acquire through 3 separate secondary market transactions that are individually below the reporting threshold, Julian began, gets us past 12% of the primary voting stock. It gets you past 12%. His voice was precise. Not me. This structure. If you're doing this, it's in your name. I'm counsel. That's all. I understand. Ms. Calloway. A pause. Not hesitation. He wasn't a man who hesitated, more like punctuation, making sure she was listening fully. I want you to understand something. What I described is legal. Every mechanism I just outlined operates within the letter of corporate law in the relevant jurisdictions. But the man whose structure this is, I know who he is. I'm not sure you do, Julian said. Not fully. There are things about the Mujin organization's history that go beyond what your assignment would have surfaced. Things that happened before Do-yoon took over. Things his father did. Another pause. Things that affected people I know. Zuri was quiet. I'm not telling you this to frighten you, he said. I'm telling you because you should know that I'm not approaching this purely as a professional exercise. She sat with that for a moment. What did his father do? A business deal in 2009. A man named... He stopped. It's a long story, not relevant to the mechanics of what you're proposing, but I want you to know my interest isn't entirely neutral. Thank you for telling me. Do you want to proceed? She looked at the cold tea. She looked at the laptop. She thought about the harbor and the pier and the 11 missed calls and the specific deadened flatness of Do-yoon's voice saying she means nothing. She thought about her daughter. She had decided sometime in the last 72 hours that it was a daughter, the way you decide certain things without evidence because something in you simply knows. And she thought about what kind of woman she was going to be in front of her. Yes, she said. We proceed. Julian began building the structure that afternoon. It took 9 days. Zuri stayed in her apartment for most of it. She ate properly, slept when she could, answered Julian's calls, and reviewed every document he sent with the same precision she brought to everything. She did not contact Do-yoon. She did not respond to the messages his assistant sent, which became progressively less formal as the days passed. The first one was professionally worded. The last one simply said, in English that felt like it had been run through translation, he is asking if you are safe. That is all he wants to know. She read that one for a long time. Then she put her phone face down on the table and went back to the shareholder documents. On the 7th day, Do-yoon did something unexpected. He came to her building, not with security. She checked through the intercom camera before she decided what to do. And it was just him, standing at the entrance to her building in a dark coat, rain on his shoulders, looking directly at the camera, the way a man looks at something when he knows he's being watched and has decided not to pretend otherwise. She watched him stand there for 4 minutes. Then she pressed the intercom button. Go away, Do-yoon. A long pause. I need to know you're safe. I'm safe. Go away. Zuri, I heard you. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. I was right there in the hallway, and I heard every word, and I need you to understand that I'm not interested in anything you want to say to me right now. I'm not ready. Go away. He was quiet for a moment. She watched him on the small screen, the set of his jaw, the rain getting heavier on his coat. Is there anything you need? Physically? Medically? She understood what he was asking. He'd looked at the footage. He'd seen her hand on her stomach. He'd done the math. That's not your question to ask, she said. Zuri. I said go away. She released the intercom button. She sat down on the floor with her back against the wall, which was not the most dignified position she'd ever been in, and she listened to the silence of the building for a long time. When she checked the camera 12 minutes later, he was gone. She didn't sleep that night. On the 9th day, Julian called at 7 a.m. with the precision of a man who had been awake since 5. It's ready, he said. Walk me through it. He did. Every entity, every transaction, every mechanism. Shares moving through carefully constructed intermediaries. Dormant clauses being activated through a legitimate trustee appointment to the Cayman Islands Trust, executed through a licensed Cayman fiduciary firm that Julian had worked with before and trusted. 3 secondary market share acquisitions, each below the individual reporting threshold, completing the voting position needed to file the shareholder petition. And at the center of all of it, Zuri Calloway. Her name, her authority, her controlling interest in the legitimate heart of the Mujin Empire. When the petition is filed, Julian said, his attorneys will have 72 hours to respond before the holding structure freezes pending review. After that, the fiduciary management agreement breach triggers a mandatory restructuring of the board. Given the ownership position you'll hold at that point, I control the board, Zuri said. You control the board. She took a breath, let it out slowly. File it, she said. She heard Julian begin to say something, and then her phone buzzed with a message notification. She looked at it. It was from Do-yoon's personal number, not his assistant. 4 words, in English, "We need to talk." She looked at the message for 3 seconds. Then she looked back at the corporate documents on her laptop screen. Then she said, into the phone, "Julian, file it now." And there was no longer any going back. The petition was filed at 7:23 a.m. on a Tuesday. Zuri knew the exact time because Julian sent her a confirmation message with the timestamp, the way a surgeon might send a notification that an incision had been made, clean, precise, irreversible. She read it sitting at her kitchen table with her second cup of tea, this one actually warm, and she felt something she didn't immediately have a name for. Not relief, not satisfaction, something quieter than both of those. The feeling of having done the thing you committed to doing and now having to live in the world where it was done. She put her phone face down on the table and ate breakfast. She was 16 weeks pregnant and her body had opinions about that, regardless of everything else happening around it. She was hungry in the mornings now, in a way that felt almost aggressive. Not nausea, she'd largely been spared that, but a deep, insistent hunger that didn't care about the state of her professional or emotional life. She made eggs. She ate them. She looked out the window at the harbor, which was doing its usual thing, enormous and indifferent. The first call from Do-yoon's attorneys came at 10:47 a.m. She didn't answer. She forwarded it to Julian and sent a 2-word message. Handle it. The second call came at 11:15 from a different number. She didn't answer that one either. The third call, at 12:03, was from Do-yoon himself. She sat with that one in her hand for 4 rings. Then she declined it and put the phone back on the table and went to her desk and opened her laptop and tried to focus on the secondary documentation Julian had asked her to review. She managed 40 minutes before she admitted to herself that she wasn't reading anything. She was staring at text that wasn't entering her brain because a different part of her brain was fully occupied with something else entirely. She knew what she was doing to him. She had known from the beginning. She wasn't naive about it, and she wasn't going to pretend to herself that she was. She was dismantling the legitimate infrastructure of an organization he had spent 15 years trying to reshape into something he could be less ashamed of. The criminal side, the parts she had no access to and had never touched, those she couldn't reach. But the hotels, the shipping terminals, the real estate, the import companies, the things he'd told her quietly during late evenings in his office that he was proud of, those she was taking, legally, precisely, because she could. She thought about his voice on those evenings, the specific way it changed when he talked about the legitimate businesses, something that wasn't quite softness, but was the closest thing to it she'd heard from him. This is what I'm building instead. That was how he'd phrased it once. Not what it was. What he was building instead. She closed the laptop and pressed her hands flat against the desk. She had not asked to be in this position. She had not asked to fall in love with a man who was going to call her nothing to protect an arranged marriage he'd apparently always intended to honor. She had not asked to be standing in that hallway. She had not asked for any of it. She opened the laptop again. She went back to work. Julian called at 3 in the afternoon with the particular controlled energy she was beginning to recognize as his version of barely contained urgency. His attorneys filed a counter-petition, Julian said, faster than I expected. How fast? 4 hours and 22 minutes from the original filing. That's not a standard response time. Someone was watching. Zuri sat up straighter. Watching the filing. Watching for it. Someone with access to the corporate registry in Hong Kong, who had standing instructions to flag any activity touching Mujin Holdings International. He paused. It's not uncommon for organizations of this type to maintain surveillance on their own corporate structures. What's less common is the specific nature of the counter-petition they filed. Tell me. They're not challenging the validity of the shareholder petition. They're not disputing the trust appointment or the share acquisition mechanism. They're claiming that the original fiduciary management agreement, the one with the documentation gap I identified, was superseded by a private amendment registered in Singapore in 2022. Zuri went very still. I didn't see a 2022 amendment. No, neither did I, because it wasn't in the documents you had access to. His voice was careful, precise. Ms. Calloway, if this amendment is authentic and their attorneys are asserting that it is, it closes the documentation gap entirely. The dormant clause doesn't trigger. The voting position you hold is real, but without the clause activation, it doesn't give you board control. It gives you minority influence, which is significant, but not what we built toward, she said. No. The kitchen was very quiet. She could hear the building's ventilation system, which she had never noticed before. She could hear her own breathing. Can you authenticate the amendment? She asked. I've already submitted a request to the Singapore registry. It'll take 24 to 48 hours to confirm whether the document is genuine and when it was actually filed. And if it's genuine? Julian was quiet for a moment. Then the petition is structurally compromised. Not dead. The voting position is still valuable and there are alternative mechanisms we can explore. But the timeline changes. The freeze doesn't trigger. Do-yoon's attorneys get ahead of this and the narrative shifts. The narrative? Who looks like the aggressor? He said it flatly. Right now the structure is clean. If this drags into a contested proceeding with conflicting documents and jurisdictional questions, the picture gets murkier. And murky is where powerful people are comfortable. Zuri stood up from her desk. She walked to the window. The harbor was getting dark in the late afternoon way it did in autumn, the water going from gray-blue to something darker and less definable. Someone tipped them off, she said. Yes. Someone who knew what we were doing before we filed. That's the most logical conclusion. She thought about who had known. Julian. Herself. The Cayman fiduciary firm. 3 parties. She had trusted all 3 because she had done her analysis and decided to trust them. She was meticulous about that kind of decision. Julian, she said carefully, is there anything you want to tell me? A pause. What are you asking? I'm asking if there's any reason someone connected to Do-yoon would have known the shape of this before we filed it. The pause this time was longer, different quality. No, he said, there isn't. She heard the flatness in it. Not offense. Julian wasn't the kind of man who performed offense. Something more controlled than that. I need you to be certain, she said. I am certain. And then, are you asking me if I have a secondary interest here? You told me yourself you weren't approaching this neutrally. I told you that out of transparency, not as a confession. I know the difference, she said. I'm asking anyway. Another long pause. When he spoke again, his voice had shifted, not defensively, but to something more level and more direct. My interest in this case predates you, he said, but it runs in the same direction as yours. I want the Mujin structure dismantled. I want it done legally and completely, and I want it done in a way that holds. I did not tip anyone off. If someone else did, we need to find them. She believed him. She wasn't certain she should, but she did. 24 hours, she said. Get me the Singapore registry confirmation. She hung up. She stood at the window for a while longer. Then she did something she hadn't done in 9 days. She called Do-yoon back. He answered on the first ring. Zuri, I need to meet with you. Her voice was controlled and clean, professional. In person. Neutral location. Just you. No attorneys, no security. A brief silence. When? Tomorrow, noon. The waterfront hotel on Haeundae. The lobby bar. Not your property. All right. Do-yoon. She stopped, started again. Come alone. I will. She hung up and looked at her phone for a long moment. Then she set it on the windowsill and pressed her palm against her stomach and stood there until the harbor went fully dark. The lobby bar at the Haeundae Hotel was quiet at noon on a Wednesday. A few business travelers, a couple near the window, a bartender polishing glasses with the mechanical focus of someone who had polished a great many glasses. Zuri arrived 8 minutes early and chose a table with sight lines to both the entrance and the elevator bank, which was habit so deeply ingrained she didn't think about it anymore. She ordered sparkling water and waited. He walked in at exactly noon, alone, as she'd asked. Dark coat, no tie. The particular economy of movement that characterized him. He didn't take up space so much as he occupied it, which was the distinction she'd noticed about him from the first week and had spent considerable time thinking about since. He looked, she noted, like he hadn't slept in several days. She wasn't going to feel guilty about that. He sat down across from her without preamble. He didn't try to touch her. He didn't open with anything personal. He looked at her directly and said, "Tell me what you want." "I want to know about the 2022 amendment." Something moved across his face, fast and controlled, but she saw it. "Which amendment?" "Don't do that," she said. "The Singapore amendment to the fiduciary management agreement." filed in 2022. Your attorneys cited it in the counterpetition this morning. I want to know what it is and why I didn't know it existed. He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the table, then back at her. It was a protective filing. My attorneys drafted it after the 2021 subsidiary absorption created the documentation gap. It was specifically designed to address the gap. It was designed to close the vulnerability I found. It was designed to protect the corporate structure. Yes, you knew about the gap. My attorneys identified it. It was on a remediation list. When? He met her eyes. June 2022. She calculated. She had arrived in Busan in October of the same year. She had been given access to documents that she now understood had been curated, not falsified, not fraudulent, but curated. The gap had been closed before she arrived. The documents she'd been given reflected the current amended structure. The pre-amendment documents, the ones Julian had used to build the petition, were historical records she had accessed through her legitimate analytical mandate. You gave me access to the historical records, she said, for your investigation. Yes, the historical records were part of the audit trail. But not the amendment. The amendment was a legal filing, not a financial document. It wasn't within the scope of your assignment. He said it carefully, evenly, without apology, but also without aggression. Zuri looked at him for a long time. The lobby bar hummed quietly around them. The bartender moved glasses from one place to another. So the petition is compromised, she said. My attorneys believe so. Yes, your attorneys are wrong about the voting position. I still hold the shares. You hold minority voting interest. It's not nothing. No, it's not nothing. His voice was quiet. Zuri, what are you actually doing? I would think that's obvious. I understand what the documents say you're doing. I'm asking what you actually want. She felt something tighten in her chest. She pressed it down. I wanted control of what you built, she said. Legally, completely. I wanted to take the thing you were most proud of and show you that it could be taken, because you took something from me and you didn't think there was a cost. He didn't flinch. He looked at her steadily, and she noticed that his jaw was tight in the way it got when he was controlling something very carefully, and she noticed that his hands on the table were still. I know what I said, he said. I know you heard it. Then we don't need to revisit it. Zuri. He leaned forward slightly. Not crowding her, just closing the distance enough to make the conversation more real. What Sungjin arranged us having you hear that conversation, he was working for the Yoon family. He wanted you gone. He chose those specific words because he knew what they would do. You still said them. Yes. You still meant to marry Hyrin. A long pause. The arrangement was real. I won't lie to you about that. Then why are we talking? Because the arrangement is finished. I ended it the day after. It's not finished, she said. Her voice was sharp and sudden, sharper than she'd planned. You're ending an engagement to a crime boss's daughter is not the same as it being finished. That's a war you just started and you know it. So don't tell me it's finished. He was quiet. He looked at his hands and then back at her. You're right, he said. It's not finished. The Yoon family is not going to accept the cancellation without consequences. I know. Which means you're in danger, whether or not the petition succeeds. Your name is on corporate documents linked to the Mujin structure, and the Yoon family has already... He stopped. She went cold. Has already what? Has already begun making inquiries about who filed the petition. She stared at him. How long have you known that? Since this morning. Do Yoon. She kept her voice level through something that cost her. How long have you known the Yoon family was looking at my name? 3 hours. And you're telling me now? I'm telling you now, he said, because I came to this meeting and you asked me to come alone. And so I came alone and I'm telling you the truth, which is what I should have done from the beginning of all of this and didn't. And I understand that that doesn't fix anything. She looked at him across the table. The lobby moved around them. A door opened somewhere and brought in a current of cold air, and then closed again. Get me a name, she said. Whatever the Yoon family is doing, whoever they've tasked with looking into this, I need a name. Zuri, a name. That's all I'm asking for right now. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached into his coat pocket, took out a folded piece of paper, and set it on the table between them. She looked at it, then at him. You already knew I was going to ask, she said. I came prepared to give you whatever you needed. I told you that on the intercom and you told me to go away. She unfolded the paper. One name, handwritten. Korean characters she could read well enough by now. Below it, an English transliteration and a position title, Yoon Hae-rin's personal security coordinator. He's not the decision maker, Do-yoon said. He's the person making the inquiries. He reports to Hae-rin directly. Her father doesn't know yet, or didn't, as of yesterday evening. Hae-rin is running this herself. Hae-rin is 27 years old and she is furious, he said, and there was something almost like respect in it, complicated and unpleasant. She was told the engagement was settled. She had plans built around it. Her father told her before I told him I was ending it, which means she found out the way I found out things I shouldn't have found out, through other people, not from me, and too late to matter. He paused. She's not who you should be afraid of. She's working through proxies right now because she doesn't have her father's authorization. But when she gets it, she goes to her father. And her father goes to war. The piece of paper was still on the table between them. Zuri looked at it. She thought about Julian's voice on the phone. My interest isn't entirely neutral. And she thought about the counterpetition filed in 4 hours and 22 minutes. And she thought about something that had been sitting at the back of her mind since the previous afternoon, not fully formed, too uncomfortable to look at directly. She picked up her phone. She called Julian. He answered in 2 rings. I was about to call you. The Singapore registry confirmation came back early. And? The amendment is genuine, filed June 14th, 2022. The petition is structurally compromised, as I said. A pause. But I've been working through an alternative mechanism. If we can establish that the 2022 amendment was filed with the intent to obstruct the rights of minority shareholders, Julian, she kept her voice even, careful. How did Do-yoon's attorneys know to file the counterpetition in 4 hours? A beat. I told you, monitoring of the corporate registry. Registry monitoring generates an alert when a filing appears. It takes time to read the filing, understand its implications, draft a counterpetition, review it with counsel, and file it. 4 hours and 22 minutes for all of that is fast. She watched Do-yoon across the table. He was watching her back, listening to her half of the conversation with the focused attention she had always found both flattering and slightly unsettling. Registry monitoring would get you the alert. It wouldn't write the counterpetition. Julian was quiet. They were ready for it, she said. They had the counterpetition already drafted, which means they didn't just know a petition had been filed. They knew what the petition would argue before we filed it. She heard her own breathing, steady, deliberate. Julian, who else did you talk to about this? No one. Julian. A longer silence this time, different from the others. I spoke with a colleague, he said. A legal contact in Singapore. It was a professional consultation. I didn't share your name or any identifying details about the corporate structure. I described the mechanism in general terms to verify my reading of the clause. A colleague in Singapore, she repeated. Yes. Who has connections to... He has no connections to the Mujin organization. Does he have connections to the Yoon family? The silence that followed was 4 seconds long, and it was the most damning 4 seconds she had experienced in a very long time. Julian. I didn't know, he said. Zuri, I want you to understand that. I didn't know he had any connection to the Yoon family. He's a legitimate attorney. We've worked together professionally for 6 years. I described a hypothetical restructuring mechanism. You described our mechanism. I didn't know, but you knew you had a personal stake in this. Her voice was not loud. It was very controlled and very cold. You told me your interest wasn't neutral. You told me there was history, and you still consulted a third party about a case that was supposed to be completely confidential. I made an error in judgment. He said it flatly. Not as an excuse, just a statement. I understand that. An error in judgment, she repeated. Julian, Hae-rin's security coordinator is currently asking questions about my name on those corporate documents. The Yoon family is going to find out I filed this petition, and when they do, that stops being a corporate problem. He didn't respond immediately. I'm sorry, he said. It came out stiff, the words sitting in his mouth like something he didn't have enough practice using. She looked at Do-yoon across the table. He had heard enough from her half of the conversation to understand the shape of what had happened. She watched him absorb it. The particular quality of stillness that he used when he was processing something that made him angry, the way the muscles in his jaw worked once and then stopped. I need you to keep working, she said to Julian. The alternative mechanism you mentioned. Develop it, fully. I need every option I have. I will. And Julian, she paused, is there anything else I don't know about your interest in this? About your contact? About anything? The pause before he answered was half a second too long. No, he said. She ended the call. She set her phone on the table. The lobby bar hummed. The bartender had moved on from glasses to bottles, wiping each one with the same mechanical attention. Your attorney has a connection to the Yoon family, Do-yoon said. It wasn't a question. Apparently, through a third party he claims he didn't know had the connection. That's what he claims. Do you believe him? She thought about it honestly. I think he's telling the truth about not knowing. I also think he was reckless, and that the recklessness wasn't random. It came from the same place his personal interest in this case comes from. He wanted to move fast. He wanted it done. He cut a corner he thought was safe. His personal interest? Do-yoon said carefully. He told me your father was involved in something that affected people he cares about. He didn't give me details. Do-yoon went very still. A different kind of still from before. Not the controlled processing stillness, but something older and heavier. What is his full name, he said. Julian Okafor. The name landed on Do-yoon's face the way a stone lands on still water. The impact small and the spread of it enormous and slow. She watched it happen. She watched him recognize the name, watched him work through whatever history lived in that recognition, watched something shift behind his eyes that she didn't have language for. You know that name, she said. Yes. Tell me. He looked at her across the table. He looked like a man who was about to say something that was going to cost him, and who had decided that the cost was acceptable. Julian Okafor's father was a business partner of my father's, he said. In 2009, a joint shipping venture in Lagos, my father structured the deal in a way that… He stopped, started again. My father took everything. The contract was fraudulent. Julian's father lost his company, his savings, and his home. He died 2 years later. Do-yoon said it without looking away. Julian has been building a case against the Mujin organization for 12 years. The lobby bar was very quiet around them. He didn't help you to take control, Do-yoon said slowly. He helped you because you were the key he needed to get inside the structure. Your access, your knowledge, your legal standing. He looked at her steadily. You gave him everything he needed to destroy the whole thing, not just the legitimate side. All of it, criminal records, financial histories, offshore accounts, everything that connects the two sides of the organization. Zuri felt the floor shift under her, not metaphorically. A physical sensation, the ground actually feeling like it was moving. He's going to release the records, she said, if he has them. I gave him the map, she said. 8 months of my work. I gave him the entire map and he knows how to… She stopped. She pressed both hands flat on the table and breathed. The legitimate businesses, the hotels, the shipping companies, the real estate, the people employed there, thousands, Do-yoon said quietly, who have nothing to do with anything my father built. If he releases the financial records connecting the criminal and legitimate sides, the regulatory freeze alone would put every legitimate entity into administration. His voice was flat. Employees lose jobs. Vendors lose contracts. People who built careers inside those companies. Collateral, she said. Yes. She looked at him across the table. He looked back at her. Around them, the lobby bar continued its quiet afternoon, completely indifferent to the fact that everything had just changed. Julian Okafor had not been helping her. He had been using her, and she had handed him the weapon. She was on her feet before she finished the thought. I need a computer, she said. Not my laptop. Something not connected to anything I've used in the last 9 days. Do-yoon didn't ask why. He stood up and pulled out his phone and made a call in Korean, 2 sentences, and within 4 minutes, a man Zuri didn't recognize appeared at the lobby entrance carrying a sealed laptop bag. Do-yoon took it and handed it to her without ceremony, and she sat back down and opened it and started working before it had fully booted. Talk me through what he can access, Do-yoon said. He sat across from her again, close enough to see the screen. Everything I sent him in the initial document package, she said, typing. The corporate map, the entity relationships, the shareholder structures, the offshore connection points. She stopped. I also sent him the pre-amendment historical records, the ones that showed the documentation gap. Those records contain everything, she said flatly. The historical records weren't just the legitimate structure, they were the full audit trail, including the accounts I flagged as irregular in my original investigation, including the connection points between the legitimate subsidiaries and the other side. Do-yoon was quiet for a moment. How many connection points? 14, maybe 16. I noted them as irregularities requiring further investigation. I didn't pursue them because they were outside my assignment scope. She looked up at him briefly. I should have pursued them. You were doing your job. I was falling in love, she said, and went back to the screen before she could see his face change. She pulled up the secure file-sharing platform she'd used to send Julian the documents. She logged in with the credentials she'd set up specifically for this case, a clean email, a separate account, nothing connected to her professional identity. The account showed the file package she'd sent 9 days ago. She clicked through to the access log. Julian had opened the package 11 times. The last access was 40 minutes ago. She felt something drop through her stomach. He's active right now. Can you revoke his access? I can revoke his access to this platform, but if he's been smart about it, and he's very smart, he made local copies on day 1. She closed her eyes briefly, opened them. I need to know what he plans to do with them and when. Call him. If I call him, he knows I've figured it out. He probably already knows you figured it out, Do-yoon said. The conversation you had, you were direct. He's had 40 minutes to run the calculation. She hated that he was right. She called Julian. It rang 6 times and went to voicemail. She called again, same result. She looked at Do-yoon. He's gone dark. Then we moved to the next problem. Do-yoon's voice had shifted. The quietness was still there, but there was something underneath it now, a forward momentum she recognized as the particular frequency he operated at when he decided a situation required action rather than deliberation. The Yoon family. What's the timeline on Hae-rin going to her father? If she hasn't already, she will when she finds your name in the corporate documents. The petition is a public filing. It's not sealed. Any competent attorney working for the Yoon family can access it. He checked his watch. We have hours, not days. What does her father do when he finds out? He calls a meeting. He calls every allied organization. He makes the case that I've broken the arrangement and allowed an outsider to penetrate the Mujin corporate structure, and he uses that to justify action. Action. Against the organization. Against me. He paused. Against you. If your name is attached to the corporate filing and he decides you're the mechanism of the attack. She looked at him. Is that what he'd decide? Yeon Byung-hak has been waiting for a reason to absorb the Mujin organization for 20 years. My father refused to merge. I refused to merge. An arranged marriage was his next best option. Now that's gone too. His voice was even and informational in the way of someone relaying a weather report for a storm that is already visible on the horizon. He'll use whatever justification is available. If your name gives him a narrative, an American financial operative who infiltrated and destabilized, he'll use it. I need a lawyer, she said. A different one. Someone local. I have someone. Not yours. Independent. He nodded. He texted someone. She watched him do it and thought about the fact that she was sitting in a hotel lobby in Busan coordinating with a man she was in the process of legally attacking against the attorney she'd hired to help her attack him, with a Korean crime family somewhere in the background assembling its own agenda. And she was 16 weeks pregnant and had eaten eggs for breakfast and had not slept properly in 9 days. She thought, this is the situation you're in. Work the situation. She went back to the laptop. The first thing she needed was to understand the exact scope of what Julian had. She pulled up the original document package and went through it file by file, reconstructing what she'd sent. Not what she'd intended to send, what she'd actually sent, because there was a difference and she needed to be precise about it. She had compiled the package in the last hour of the 9th day, after the call with Julian when he'd said, "It's ready," and she'd said, "File it now," and she'd been moving fast and running on insufficient sleep and the compressed momentum of 9 days of focused anger. She had sent 43 files. She had intended to send 31. She sat very still for a moment. There are 12 files in that package that shouldn't be there, she said. Her voice came out flat, clinical. The voice she used when the numbers showed something she didn't want to see, and she had to say it anyway. I was moving fast. I compiled the full working folder instead of the curated package. The additional 12 files include... She stopped, pulled up the file list, read it. They include 4 internal memos I wrote summarizing my analysis of the irregular accounts. They include 2 preliminary network maps I created showing the connection points between the legitimate and other structures. They include my original investigation notes. Do-yoon leaned forward slightly and looked at the screen. She let him. It was past the point of managing what he saw. Your investigation notes identify individuals, he said, by role, not name, but combined with the network maps and someone who knows the organization. They become a directory, he said. Yes. He sat back. He pressed his thumb and forefinger against the bridge of his nose for exactly 2 seconds. Then he put his hand down. People in those notes who have nothing to do with the criminal side. At least 7, probably more. If Julian releases everything to regulators or law enforcement, broad discovery, she said, everyone in those documents gets scrutinized. And in a Korean regulatory investigation touching an organization like this, scrutiny alone is career-ending, at minimum. They looked at each other. I have to stop him, she said. Yes. I don't know where he is. I can find him. She understood what that meant and what it would cost him to do it, and she didn't argue about it. How long? Less than an hour, she nodded. He made a call. She went back to the laptop and started drafting a legal order. Not something she was qualified to draft herself, but a framework she could hand to an attorney who could turn it into something actionable. She worked with the focused mechanical intensity she'd always been able to access when the situation required it, the part of her brain that ran parallel to the emotional part and didn't wait for permission. 22 minutes later, Do-yoon said quietly, Singapore. He's at Changi, departing in 3 hours. Where to? New York. She thought about that. He's going to file with American regulators, the SEC. If the Mujin accounts touched U.S. financial instruments, some of them did, not many. Enough. SEC involvement triggers parallel investigation requests to Korean regulators and Interpol. She pressed the heel of her hand against her forehead. It becomes a cascade. Yes. She stood up. I need to get to Singapore. There's a flight in 90 minutes. You already checked. I checked when you stood up. His voice was matter-of-fact. I'll come with you. No. Zuri, I need you here, she said. I need you managing the Yoon situation. If Haerin goes to her father while we're both in Singapore, what do you think I can do about the Yoon situation? You can buy time. You can call Yoon Byung-hak yourself and request a meeting, not to restore the arrangement. He'll know that's finished, but to offer him something, whatever you have to offer, time, a business concession, anything that buys 48 hours. He looked at her steadily. He'll know I'm stalling. He'll know, and he'll meet with you anyway, because he's a man who thinks face-to-face meetings give him an advantage, and he'll want to see you diminished. She picked up the laptop bag. Let him think he has the advantage. Just give me 48 hours. He stood up. He looked at her with the particular attention she had always found simultaneously reassuring and exhausting. The look of someone who was processing her completely, not just the words. You're going to Singapore alone, he said, pregnant, to confront an attorney who has been building a case against this organization for 12 years and who now has everything he needs to execute it. Yes. And you think he'll, what, listen to you? I think he wants the Mujin organization destroyed, she said. I think what he doesn't want, if I can make him understand it, is to destroy 3,000 people who happen to work in the hotels and logistics companies and real estate offices. I think somewhere inside Julian Okafor's 12-year revenge plan, there is still a man who knows the difference between justice and obliteration. And if you're wrong about that, she looked at him, then I'll have to find another way. She was at the airport in 35 minutes, through security in 15, on the plane in 40. She had the new laptop in the overhead bin, her phone fully charged, and a protein bar she'd bought at a kiosk because she hadn't eaten since morning, and the baby had opinions about that. She ate it without tasting it and stared out the window at the tarmac and made a list in her head. Stop Julian. That was first, survive the Yoon family. That was second, and not entirely within her control, which she acknowledged and filed away because she couldn't work that problem from 35,000 feet. Figure out what came after. That was third. And she didn't let herself go there yet because after assumed she got through the first two things and she had learned a long time ago not to plan past the immediate crisis. The flight to Singapore was 4 hours and 40 minutes. She slept for 90 minutes of it, the deep unconscious sleep of a body that had finally overridden the brain's protests, and woke up with 30 minutes to landing feeling slightly more functional than she had in days. She used the remaining time to pull up the secure platform on the laptop and look at Julian's access log again. He had accessed the files one more time since she'd last checked. 58 minutes ago, 4 minutes after her plane took off. He was still compiling, still working, which meant he hadn't filed anything yet. She landed at Changi at 9:14 p.m. local time and was through the gate in 11 minutes because she had only carry-on and her credentials still opened the expedited immigration lane she'd used on previous professional trips through Singapore. She found a corner of the arrivals hall with a power outlet and called Do Yoon. "Yoon meeting?" she said when he answered. "Tomorrow morning, 10 a.m. He accepted faster than I expected. A pause. "Which either means he's more interested in a negotiated resolution than I thought, or he's already decided what he's going to do and the meeting is a formality. Keep him talking regardless." "I know how to keep him talking." His voice was dry. "Where are you?" "Arrivals hall. I need Julian's location at the airport. You said Changi?" "Terminal 1. He has a business class seat on the 11:55 Singapore Airlines flight to JFK. Check-in is already confirmed." "Which means he's through security." "Yes." She looked at the departures board. Terminal 1, 11:55 p.m. She had 2 hours and 40 minutes. "Thank you," she said. "Zuri." A brief pause, something careful in his voice. "Be careful." She didn't answer that. She hung up and moved. She found Julian in the Chris Flyer lounge on the 3rd floor of Terminal 1, which required a business class boarding pass to enter, and which she did not have. She stood at the lounge entrance for 30 seconds, long enough to confirm through the glass partition that the tall Nigerian-British man sitting alone at a corner table with a whiskey and an open laptop was, in fact, Julian Okafor. And then she walked to the service desk and told the agent, in the calm, direct voice of someone accustomed to professional authority, that she needed to send an urgent message to a passenger inside the lounge. The agent gave her a piece of paper and an envelope. She wrote 3 words. "The Yoon family." She folded it, wrote Julian's name on the outside, and handed it back. She stepped back from the desk and waited. 4 minutes passed. Then Julian appeared at the lounge entrance. He looked at her with the expression of a man who had been expecting something, but not specifically this. He looked tired. He looked like he hadn't slept on the flight from Seoul. He looked like a man who had been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and was close enough to putting it down that the anticipation of it was visible on his face. "Miss Calloway," he said. "We need to talk," she said. "Not in there. Somewhere quieter." He looked at her for a moment. Then he stepped out of the lounge and fell into step beside her without argument, which she noted. He wasn't going to pretend he didn't know why she was here. They found an empty gate area, 3 gates down. A section between flights, the seating rows empty, the wide windows showing the tarmac and the dark Singapore night beyond it. She sat down. He sat across from her. His laptop bag was over his shoulder. He hadn't left it in the lounge, which told her he had the files with him. "The Yoon family note," he said. "That was to get me out of the lounge." "Yes." "Are they actually involved?" "Yes. Bayron's security coordinator has been investigating my name since the petition was filed. Her father will know by tomorrow morning." She looked at him directly. "Which is one of several things you didn't account for when you decided I was a useful instrument." He met her eyes. He didn't look away, and he didn't try to defend the description. "I owe you an explanation," he said. "You owe me the truth. The explanation can be short." He put the laptop bag on the seat beside him. He put his hands on his knees and looked at the window for a moment and then back at her. "My father built a shipping company in Lagos over 20 years, he said. It was everything he had. 2009, he entered a joint venture with the Mujin organization. Yu Chang-ho, Do Yoon's father, structured the contract with a clause that allowed him to trigger a forced buyout at below market value if certain performance benchmarks weren't met. The benchmarks were designed to fail. My father never had a chance to meet them." His voice was even and informational, the way Do Yoon's voice had been even and informational, and she thought, this is what people do when they've rehearsed the pain so many times it comes out flat. He lost the company. He lost the savings he'd put in as collateral. He lost the house my mother had lived in for 30 years. He died in 2011 of a cardiac event. He was 58 years old and he had nothing left to his name. Zuri looked at him. "I'm sorry," she said. She meant it. "The Mujin organization still exists," he said. "Cheng Ho died in 2018, and Do-yoon inherited it, and Do-yoon is not his father. I know that. I've studied the organization for 12 years. I know exactly what changed under Do-yoon and what didn't." He paused. "What didn't change is that the money my father lost is still in that structure. Clean, transformed, invested, grown. It's in every hotel and shipping terminal and real estate property. So you want it dismantled. I want justice." He said it without heat, just stated it. "I have wanted justice for 12 years, and I have spent 12 years building a case, and every time I got close, the jurisdictional complexity shut me down. I needed someone inside, someone with legitimate access and financial expertise, and enough personal motivation to do it without asking too many questions," she said. He held her gaze. "Yes. You used me. I helped you," he said. "Genuinely. The corporate structure I built for you was real. The mechanism was legitimate. You would have had control. And then the records would have been released, and the organization would have faced full investigation and justice, and 3,000 employees," she said, "who would have lost their jobs, who would have had their careers investigated because their names appear in documents connected to a criminal organization they didn't know they were working for." He was quiet. "Julian," she leaned forward, "you know exactly how broad regulatory discovery gets in cases like this. You know that the legitimate businesses would be frozen during investigation. You know that the people inside them are not the targets. They're the collateral, and you know it." She kept her voice steady. "You built your entire plan around the idea that the Mujin organization deserved to be destroyed, and you were right that it deserved to be destroyed. But you had 12 years to figure out how to do it surgically, and you chose a mechanism that was more like setting the building on fire and hoping the people inside got out." Something moved across his face. Not flinching exactly. Julian Okafor didn't flinch, but a tightening, a shift. "What do you want from me?" he said. "I want you to not file anything tonight. The case is built. The documents are—" "I know you have the files," she said. "I know you have everything. I sent it to you and you made copies and you have them and I can't take them back. I'm not asking you to destroy them." She took a breath. "I'm asking you to give me 48 hours to separate the structures first." He looked at her. "Separate them how?" "The legitimate companies need to be formally and legally severed from the criminal organization before any investigation begins. If the investigation starts with them connected, everything gets frozen together. If I use the voting position I hold, the minority interest, which is real and valid, to push through an emergency board resolution separating the structures, the legitimate companies are legally independent before the investigation starts. A board resolution requires a board meeting, which I can call as a significant minority shareholder under the Hong Kong Corporate Code. Do-yoon won't block it." She said it with more certainty than she fully felt. "He knows what's coming. He won't block a resolution that protects the employees." Julian studied her. "You've spoken with him. Today, at length. And you trust him to cooperate with a board resolution that strips him of control over his own legitimate holdings." "I trust him to protect the people working inside them," she said. "That's different from trusting him in general, and it's specific enough to be useful." Julian looked at the window for a long time. The tarmac outside was busy with the slow mechanical movements of baggage vehicles and fuel trucks, the night logistics of an airport between waves of flights. "If I wait 48 hours, he said slowly, "and the board resolution doesn't go through, then you file everything and you have the same outcome you have now, minus 48 hours. And if the Yoon family moves in the next 48 hours, that's my problem. It becomes my problem if it compromises the case. Julian," she said his name the way you say the name of someone who is very intelligent and who is currently choosing not to use that intelligence honestly. "You have had this case ready to file for how long?" He hesitated. 8 months. She stared at him. 8 months. "The mechanism was built. I needed the internal access to complete the evidentiary package. You were waiting for someone like me to appear. I was waiting for the right opportunity." "You waited 8 months, she said. "You can wait 48 hours. He looked at her for a long time. She looked back. Outside the windows, a plane began moving slowly away from a distant gate, its lights blinking in the dark and the patient rhythm of something enormous and indifferent to the human negotiations happening behind the terminal glass. "Why are you doing this?" he said. "For him." "I'm not doing it for him," she said. "I'm doing it because I spent 8 months inside those companies, and I know the people running them didn't choose what their organization was built on." The woman who manages the hotel group's HR department worked her way up from a housekeeping position over 15 years. The logistics director built the shipping division's safety record from scratch after a terrible accident in 2019. Those people aren't the Mujin organization. They're just people who went to work. She pressed her palms against her thighs. "I'm not willing to burn them to punish him." Julian was quiet for a long time. She let the silence sit. She had learned a long time ago that the instinct to fill silence was how you lost negotiations. 48 hours, he said finally. 48 hours. If the board resolution fails or is blocked, I call you myself. He looked at her. Something shifted in his face. Not warmth exactly, but something adjacent to respect that lived in the same neighborhood. "You flew to Singapore alone," he said. "Tonight, in your condition." "Don't," she said. I'm simply—" He stopped. It was a statement, not a criticism. 48 hours, she said again. "Agreed?" He picked up his laptop bag. He stood. He looked down at her with the expression of a man making a calculation he knows is not entirely rational and choosing to make it anyway. "Agreed," he said. She got him to shake on it, which was not legally binding but was something, a physical commitment, a gesture that cost him something minimal and cost her nothing. And both of them knew it, and neither of them acknowledged it because they were adults who understood the limited vocabulary of trust between people who had just explained to each other how they'd each been using the other. She booked a flight back to Busan for 6 a.m. She found a chair near a power outlet and plugged in and sat down and called Do-yoon. "Julian agreed," she said when he answered. 48 hours, but I need the board resolution to go through, and I need it fast. I'll call the board tonight. They won't be happy." "No, they won't." A pause. "The resolution separates the legitimate companies from the organization. Completely, legally, documented. Which means I lose the holding structure." "Yes." He was quiet. She thought he was going to argue. She waited. "All right," he said. "Just, all right? What do you want me to say?" "I thought you'd push back." "The legitimate side was always supposed to be separate," he said. "I've been trying to make it separate for 15 years. If this is how it happens—" He stopped. "It's not the method I would have chosen, but the outcome is what I wanted." She sat with that for a moment. "The Yoon meeting, tomorrow morning. 10 a.m. I'll keep him talking. If he finds out about the board resolution before it's filed, he won't." His voice was certain in a way that she decided to borrow some confidence from because she was running low on her own. "I know how to manage Byung-hak. I've been managing him for 7 years. Do-yoon." She pressed her back against the chair. She was exhausted in a way that went deeper than physical. The bone-deep exhaustion of someone who has been operating at maximum capacity for 11 days and is almost through the thing that required it. After the board resolution goes through, after Julian files, after the investigation starts. "Yes. The organization is finished," he said. "I know. I mean you, personally. What happens to you?" A long silence. "That depends on what the investigation finds and who makes decisions about what to do with it. Julian has evidence of fraud. Your father's fraud. 12 years of it." "Yes." "And the organization's current accounts." "Yes." "Are you—" She stopped. "Do-yoon, are you personally exposed?" He was quiet for long enough that she had her answer before he gave it. "There are accounts I have maintained that a competent prosecutor could characterize as ongoing," he said, carefully. The characterization would require interpretation, but it's possible. "You could go to prison." "It's possible," he said again. She pressed her hand against her stomach. The baby moved, not dramatically, just the small internal shift she'd started feeling in the last 2 weeks that still startled her every time. That small reminder of the specific stakes of all of this. "I need you to do something," she said, "before the board meeting, before anything else." "Tell me." "I need you to talk to Julian's contact, the attorney in Singapore who your father—" She stopped. "There may be records of the 2009 deal with Julian's father. the fraudulent contract, the forced buyout mechanism. She chose her next words carefully. If there is documentation of what your father did, and if that documentation could be surrendered, proactively, to the right authority. Silence. That's different from what Julian is filing, he said. Yes, it's you taking responsibility for something your father did before someone else forces it. It's different, and it matters. She paused. It won't necessarily protect you from the other exposure, but it changes the shape of what you are in this situation. It changes whether you're someone things happen to or someone who decides what happens. The silence stretched out. She listened to the ambient noise of the airport around her. Announcements, wheels on tile, the distant percussion of engines. You're asking me to hand a prosecutor evidence against my own organization, he said. I'm asking you to hand a prosecutor evidence of your father's crime against another family, she said. Because Julian Okafor's father deserved justice 12 years ago and didn't get it, and Julian has spent his whole adult life trying to get it anyway, and he made bad choices doing it, and so did I, and so did you, and at some point, somebody in this situation has to decide to do the right thing, regardless of the cost. Another long silence. When he spoke, his voice was different, still quiet, still controlled. But something underneath it had changed. Some qualities she didn't have precise language for. The specific sound of a person setting something down they have been holding for a very long time. I'll make the call tonight, he said. Tonight. Tonight. A pause. Zuri? Don't, she said. I need to... Not tonight, she said. Whatever it is. Not tonight. Do the board call. Make the Singapore call. Tomorrow morning, manage Yoon Byung-hak. That's what tonight needs to be. He was quiet. Okay. 48 hours, she said. 48 hours, he agreed. She ended the call and put her phone in her lap and closed her eyes. The airport moved around her in its perpetual, restless way, the specific controlled chaos of a transit hub that never fully sleeps. And she sat in the middle of it and breathed and felt the baby move again and thought, 48 hours. Then whatever comes after. She did not let herself think about what after looked like. Not yet. She sat in the gate chair in Terminal 1 of Changi Airport and waited for 6 a.m. and thought about a woman who had arrived in Busan on a 6-month assignment 10 months ago with a carry-on bag and a reputation for precision and no intention whatsoever of any of this. And she thought, that woman had no idea, which was almost funny, except that funny required a kind of distance she didn't have yet. At 4:47 a.m., her phone buzzed. A message from Do-yoon. Board meeting is set, 9 a.m. tomorrow. Resolution is drafted. Also, I spoke with the Singapore contact. He has the original 2009 contract documents, all of them. I've arranged for them to be transferred to the Korean prosecutor's office by morning. She read it twice. Then a second message arrived. The Yoon family just moved up the meeting. Byung-hak wants to see me tonight. In 2 hours. She sat up straight. He knows about the board resolution. She stared at the screen. Her flight back to Busan boarded in 73 minutes. And then a third message, sent 40 seconds after the second. Don't come back tonight. Stay in Singapore until morning. I mean it. She was already standing, already pulling up the airline app to see if there was an earlier flight, when a fourth message came through. Not from Do-yoon, from a number she didn't recognize, a Korean number. And the message was in English, which meant it was meant for her specifically, Ms. Calloway. You have inserted yourself into matters that do not concern you. This is a courtesy notification. The next contact will not be courteous. She read it. She looked at the departures board. There was a 5:15 a.m. flight to Busan. She had 28 minutes to make it. She made the 5:15 flight with 4 minutes to spare. She ran the last 200 meters to the gate with her laptop bag across her body and her boarding pass on her phone, and the specific focused tunnel vision of someone who has made a decision and is now simply executing it. And she didn't let herself think about whether it was the right decision, because there wasn't time for that. And because on some level she already knew that right and wrong had stopped being the operative categories sometime around the third message from the unknown Korean number. She found her seat. She sat down. She put her hands flat on her thighs and breathed. The plane pushed back at 5:19. She texted Do-yoon. On a flight. Landing 7:40. Do not meet Byung-hak without me. She watched the message deliver, watched it sit unread for 3 minutes. 5 minutes. The plane climbed and the Singapore lights fell away beneath it, and the message stayed unread. She put her phone away and looked out the window at the dark and thought about what she knew and what she didn't. What she knew, Yoon Byung-hak had moved the meeting up, which meant someone inside Do-yoon's organization, what remained of it after Sung-jin's departure, had told him about the board resolution, which meant Byung-hak had understood the resolution for what it was, not just a corporate restructuring, but the formal beginning of the end of the Mujin organization's power in a form he could leverage, which meant the meeting he wanted was not a negotiation. What she didn't know, whether Do-yoon understood that. She thought he did. She thought he was smart enough and had known Byung-hak long enough to understand it, but understanding a thing and being fully prepared for it were different. And Do-yoon had spent the last 10 days managing more simultaneous crises than any person should have to manage. And the 2009 documents he'd surrendered to prosecutors that night were going to make his own legal exposure significantly more complicated before they made it better. And she didn't know what condition he was in when Byung-hak's people showed up. The flight was 2 hours and 25 minutes. She slept for none of it. She reviewed documents she'd already reviewed and made notes she'd already made, and stared at the seat back in front of her and counted the ways this could go badly, which was a habit she'd had since childhood, and which had never once made anything go less badly, but which she couldn't stop doing because her brain required the activity of anticipation even when the anticipation produced nothing useful. At 7:38 a.m., she landed at Gimhae. Her phone came off airplane mode and 3 messages loaded simultaneously. The first was from Do-yoon, sent at 6:02 a.m. Meeting is at the Mujin Tower. Not Byung-hak's location, my ground, I insisted. He agreed. The second was from Do-yoon, sent at 6:47 a.m. They're here, 14 of them. He brought 14 people to a meeting. The third was from Do-yoon, sent at 7:31 a.m., 9 minutes before she landed. And it was 2 words, hurry, please. She was in a taxi before the second message finished loading. The Mujin Tower was a 40-story glass building overlooking the harbor, the legitimate headquarters of the holding group, not the criminal infrastructure, the place where the hotels and logistics and real estate businesses were actually run by the people who ran them. Zuri had been inside it dozens of times during her assignment. She knew the security desk, the elevator banks, the layout of the upper floors. She knew that the main conference room on the 38th floor had floor-to-ceiling windows and a view of the harbor that was, objectively, one of the most imposing rooms she had ever been in. She also knew that 14 people to a meeting meant Byung-hak hadn't come to talk. She called Do-yoon as the taxi crossed the bridge. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. She called again. Same result. She called his secondary number, which she had because she was the kind of person who always got a secondary number. That one rang twice and was answered by a voice she didn't recognize, young, male, tense. "Who is this?" she said. "Mr. Han's assistant. He can't take calls right now." "Tell him Zuri is 5 minutes away and I need to know the status of the room." A muffled sound. A pause. Then Do-yoon's voice, lower than usual, in the compressed register of someone who is in a room full of people and is stepping slightly away from them to speak. "Don't come up," he said. "I'm already in the taxi. Zuri, 5 minutes. Status." A breath. Byung-hak has 14 men positioned in the building, 2 in the lobby, 4 on the floor below this one, the rest distributed. This isn't a meeting, it's a demonstration of position. Is anyone hurt? Not yet. What does he want? He wants me to withdraw the board resolution and reinstate the engagement arrangement, or he absorbs the Mujin organization by force. He's framed it as a merger offer. It's not a merger offer. What's your current legal status with prosecutors? They confirmed receipt of the documents. They've opened a preliminary inquiry. A pause. Which Byung-hak also knows about. One of his attorneys has a contact in the prosecutor's office. So he knows you've cooperated with prosecutors. Yes, which makes the forced merger significantly more attractive to him. If he absorbs the organization before the inquiry gains momentum, the assets move under his umbrella and the investigators have to start over with a new target. She thought fast. The board resolution, was it filed this morning? Filed and registered at 7 a.m., Hong Kong Corporate Registry confirmed. Then the legitimate companies are already legally severed. On paper, Byung-hak doesn't recognize paper if he has 14 men in the building. The taxi pulled up to the Mujin Tower entrance. She could see 2 men in suits positioned just inside the lobby doors. She told the driver to stop half a block short. "I'm going to need 10 minutes, she said into the phone. "Keep him talking." Zuri, these are not people you walk into a room with. I'm already walking into the room. She got out of the taxi. 10 minutes. Talk about anything. The weather. The harbor. His daughter's excellent taste in security coordinators. 10 minutes. She hung up before he could argue. She stood on the sidewalk outside the Mujin Tower and looked at the building and looked at the two men in the lobby and thought about the specific geometry of the problem. She couldn't go through the lobby. Not without being stopped, identified, and almost certainly used as a variable Byung-hak hadn't planned for, which could go well or very badly depending on how he chose to deploy her. She went around to the service entrance. She knew where it was because she had asked, in her third week on the assignment, to see the building's infrastructure. Ventilation systems, electrical, server rooms, as part of understanding the operational costs of the hotel group's facilities management contracts. The facilities manager had taken her through every service corridor in the building because nobody with actual authority had told him not to, and she had the kind of face and manner that made people assume she had actual authority. The service entrance required a key card she didn't have. She stood outside it for 30 seconds and then knocked. The maintenance worker who opened it was a man in his 50s she had never met. She showed him her corporate ID. Still valid, still identifying her as a senior analyst retained by the Mujin Group, and said in Korean carefully that she needed access to the building on an urgent matter and that she needed him not to call the main desk about it. He looked at her ID, he looked at her face, he looked at the corporate logo on the ID. He opened the door. She thanked him and took the service elevator to the 37th floor and walked up one flight of stairs and entered the 38th floor through the stairwell door at the end of the corridor, which put her at the opposite end of the floor from the conference room. She moved down the corridor. She could hear voices before she reached the conference room. Byung-hak's, she assumed, the low authoritative rumble of a man performing power for an audience. She couldn't hear Do-yoon's voice, which meant he was either not speaking or speaking very quietly. She reached the conference room door and opened it and walked in. 14 heads turned toward her, 16 counting Do-yoon and Byung-hak. Yoon Byung-hak was 63 years old and looked like a man who had made decisions about other people's lives for so long that it had settled into his physical structure, the set of his shoulders, the way his hands rested on the table as if the table were already his. He was not physically imposing. He was the other kind of dangerous, the kind that has done the calculation before you arrived and already knows the outcome. Do-yoon was seated at the head of the conference table. He looked at her when she entered with the specific expression of a man who had asked her not to come and is not surprised she came anyway and has complicated feelings about both of those facts simultaneously. "Who is this?" Byung-hak said, in English, which meant he already knew. "Zuri Calloway," she said. She pulled out the chair nearest the door and sat down without being invited. "Controlling minority shareholder of Mujin Holdings International Group. I'm also the person who filed the board resolution this morning. If you have questions about either of those things, I'm the right person to answer them." Byung-hak looked at her for a long moment. His expression didn't change. That was the thing about men like him. The face was a managed surface, not a readable one. "The board resolution is irrelevant," he said. "It pertains to a corporate structure that will shortly cease to exist in its current form. The board resolution was filed and registered at 7 a.m. this morning with the Hong Kong Corporate Registry," she said. "It legally separates the legitimate subsidiary companies from the parent organization. That separation is complete and cannot be reversed without a shareholder vote that I would block." She put her hands flat on the table. "Which means the hotels, the logistics companies, the real estate properties. None of them are part of whatever you're proposing to absorb. They belong to a newly independent corporate structure. They're not on the table." Byung-hak looked at her with the patient attention of a man who is allowing someone to finish speaking before he explains why what they said doesn't matter. "The separation was filed this morning," he said. "My attorneys will challenge its validity by this afternoon. Jurisdictional questions, procedural issues. These things take time." "Your attorneys will challenge it," she said. "Yes. And the challenge will be heard in the Hong Kong courts, not Korean courts, because that's where the holding company is registered. And in the meantime, the separation stands because that's how filing and registration work." She looked at him directly. "You know this. You're not actually here about the board resolution." Something shifted in his face. Minimal. A recalculation. "Tell me what you're actually here about," she said. He looked at Do-yoon. Do-yoon looked at the table. A muscle in his jaw worked once and stopped. My daughter, Byung-hak said. Haerin, she said, was promised an arrangement, a legitimate business alliance, formalized through marriage. The arrangement was dishonored. The arrangement was ended, she said, which is Do-yoon's right. Arrangements end. Not in this business. You're not in that business anymore, she said. Neither is Do-yoon. As of this morning, the Mujin organization's legitimate holdings are legally independent. As of last night, Do-yoon provided documentation to Korean prosecutors of historical financial crimes associated with the Mujin organization's prior leadership. The organization itself, she paused, is in the process of being wound down. The room was very quiet. Byung-hak looked at Do-yoon. You went to prosecutors. Do-yoon met his eyes. Yes. Voluntarily. Yes. Byung-hak sat with that for a moment. The men around the room shifted slightly. Not dramatically, not in any way that was specifically threatening, but the quality of the air in the room changed. The adjustment of people who have arrived prepared for one scenario and are recalculating for another. Then you have nothing left to protect, Byung-hak said, which raises the question of why I shouldn't simply, because of the 14 men you brought with you, Zuri said, and the choice you're about to make about what to do with them. She kept her voice even, level. She was aware of her own heartbeat, steady, faster than normal, but steady. You came here to demonstrate position. You've done that. Everyone in this room understands your position. But Do-yoon has already cooperated with prosecutors, which means this building is already on a list of addresses they'll review, and the meeting you're currently having with 14 men positioned through the building is the kind of meeting that looks very specific in a preliminary inquiry. Byung-hak's eyes moved to her face and stayed there. You're not a target yet, she said. The inquiry is about the Mujin organization's prior conduct. What you do in the next 30 minutes determines whether you stay not a target. The silence stretched. You're a financial analyst, Byung-hak said. From America. Yes. You're pregnant. Also yes. And you're telling me what I should do. I'm telling you what the landscape is, she said. What you do with that is your decision. He looked at her for a long time. She looked back. She did not look at Do-yoon. She kept her eyes on Byung-hak because he was the decision-maker in the room and because looking away from him now would cost her the specific credibility she had established by walking in and sitting down and speaking first. Byung-hak stood up. He buttoned his jacket. He looked at Do-yoon with the expression of a man closing a door he has had open for a long time. Not a clean expression, not a forgiving one, but a final one. The Yoon family will pursue the legal challenge to the board resolution, he said, through proper channels. That's your right, she said. He looked at her one more time, something in his face that wasn't quite respect and wasn't quite dismissal. Something more like a man encountering a variable he hadn't expected and acknowledging privately that it changed his calculation. Then he left. His 14 men followed in the specific organized way of people who have been trained to follow without making it look like following. The conference room door closed. Zuri put both hands on the table and breathed. Do-yoon said nothing for a long time. The harbor was enormous and bright through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the morning light coming off the water in the clean, hard way it did in autumn, and the city stretched out beneath it doing its endless patient thing. You told him the organization was being wound down, he said finally. Yes. I hadn't told him that. I know. She looked at the table. Is it true? A long pause. Yes, he said. I decided last night, after the call with the Singapore contact, after the prosecutors. He said it without drama, without ceremony, just stated it. It's finished. It should have been finished a long time ago. She looked at him. He looked back at her. He looked exhausted in a way that went past physical. The exhaustion of a man who has been holding something very heavy for 15 years and has just set it down and is now experiencing, for the first time, the full weight of everything he let go. The legitimate companies will be fine, she said. The board resolution holds. The separation is legal. The employees will keep their jobs, he said. Yes, I know. Julian will file his case. The criminal investigation will run its course. I know. Your personal exposure. I know, Zuri. His voice was quiet, not sharp, just certain. He knew. He had known since last night, and he had made the call to prosecutors anyway. I have attorneys. I'll cooperate, whatever it costs. She looked at him across the conference table. The man she had fallen in love with in this building, in this city, over 8 months of late evenings and convenience store coffee and arguments about property valuation discrepancies. She looked at him the way you look at someone when you're trying to see them clearly rather than the way you want to see them, which is harder and more important and always costs something. He was not the man she'd thought he was in the first month. He was also not the man she'd thought he was in that hallway. He was something more complicated than either of those, which was the true and disappointing and occasionally hopeful thing about people. "I need to go," she said. "I have a call with my firm in Charlotte at noon. I've been on extended assignment for 10 months, and they're not going to be happy about how it ended." "How will you explain it?" "I'll file a complete final report," she said. "The irregularities I was sent to investigate, plus everything I found beyond the scope of the assignment. I'll recommend they forward it to the relevant authorities, which they will, because that's their legal obligation." She paused. "It'll be the most thorough report I've ever written. It'll also be the report that confirms everything prosecutors need." "Yes." He looked at her. "You know that implicates you, in the corporate structure, in the takeover attempt." "I know, I have attorneys too." She picked up her bag. "The takeover attempt failed. The mechanism was legitimate. The fact that it failed doesn't change the legality of the attempt." "The Yoon family legal challenge will lose," she said. "Eventually. Corporate law in Hong Kong is clear. It'll take time and it'll cost money and it'll be unpleasant. But it'll lose." She stood up. "Do Yoon." He looked at her. Something in his face that she hadn't seen there before, or had seen and not named correctly. Something open and undefended in the way that people are only when they've lost the thing they were defending. "The child," he said. "My daughter," she said. "Your daughter." He said it carefully, accepting the correction and what it meant. What do you need from me?" "For her." She thought about how to answer that honestly. She had been thinking about it for 10 months, or more accurately, for the specific 10 months since she'd stood in a hallway and had the architecture of her assumptions taken apart, and she had not arrived at a clean answer because there wasn't one. "I don't know yet," she said. "I need time." She needs time. She hasn't arrived yet, and she already has a complicated inheritance, and I need to figure out how to tell that story in a way she can live with when she's old enough to hear it. "I'll wait," he said. "I know you will." "I'm not saying it to—" "I know," she said. "I believe you." She stopped at the door. "The Pojangmacha cart. 2 blocks east." He looked at her. Something moved across his face. "It's still there," he said. "I know. I walked past it this morning." She looked at him one more time. "Do Yoon, you made the right call last night, with the prosecutors, with the documents. I need you to know I understand what it cost." He didn't say anything. She didn't wait for him to. She left. The weeks that followed were not tidy. They were not the kind of weeks that resolve cleanly into a shape you can explain to other people. They were the kind of weeks that are simply what comes after, the administrative and legal and personal aftermath of a situation that had involved too many moving parts for any of them to stop moving all at once, just because the central crisis had passed. Julian filed his case with the Korean prosecutor's office on the 47th hour of his 48-hour agreement, which was either respect for the letter of his word or a demonstration that he was the kind of man who did things on his own terms until the last possible moment. Zuri suspected it was both. The filing triggered a parallel inquiry request to Singapore and a joint investigation protocol with Korean financial crimes authorities that would take years to fully resolve. These things always did. But the preliminary freeze targeted the criminal accounts, not the legitimate companies, because the board resolution had done its job and the separation was legally clean. The hotels stayed open. The logistics division kept running. The woman who had worked her way up from housekeeping over 15 years retained her position as HR director of the hotel group and never knew, precisely, how close it had come to going differently. Zuri submitted her final report to her firm in Charlotte on a Tuesday morning. It was 47 pages long, and it was, as she had told Do-yoon it would be, the most thorough report she had ever written. Her firm forwarded it to the relevant authorities within 24 hours, as legally required. They also, in the same communication, informed her that her contract was being terminated effective immediately, which she had also expected. She thanked them for the professional experience, which she meant in the complicated way that you can mean something and simultaneously recognize that it cost you more than it should have. She hired a Korean attorney to manage the Yoon family legal challenge. He was not cheap, and he was not warm, and he was exactly as competent as Do-yoon's recommendation had suggested, which she appreciated even though she was still not quite ready to appreciate things that came from Do-yoon without a layer of ambivalence. Hae-rin's challenge to the board resolution moved through the Hong Kong courts slowly, as Zuri had predicted. It failed on the central jurisdictional argument within 4 months, and the secondary procedural challenge failed 6 weeks after that. Yoon Hae-rin was, by all accounts, furious. She was also, by all accounts, the kind of person who would redirect that fury productively, which Zuri found herself hoping for in the abstract way you hope for things involving people you will never meet. Yoon Byung-hak never made contact again. Whether that was a strategic calculation or simply the decision of a man who recognized a closed door, she didn't know and didn't pursue. Some things you let stay closed. Do-yoon's legal situation was slower and more difficult than anyone's optimism could fully accommodate. The prosecutors were not interested in making it easy for him simply because he had cooperated, which was correct. Cooperation is not absolution, and the accounts he had maintained were real and documented and could not be wished away by good intentions. What cooperation bought him was consideration. The difference between a prosecution pursued with maximum aggression and one pursued with the understanding that the subject had been forthcoming. It wasn't a small difference. It also wasn't a resolution, and the process ground forward at the pace these things always did, which was not a comfortable pace for anyone involved. He did not contact her during this time. She had not asked him not to, but she hadn't had to. He seemed to understand, or had decided to demonstrate that he understood, that there was a difference between waiting and pressing, and that the former was what she needed from him and the latter was what he would have preferred, and so he chose the former. She noticed. She didn't say so to him because she was not ready to say things to him yet, but she noticed. Her daughter was born on a cold February morning in a hospital in Busan, because Zuri had not left Korea after all. She had considered it. She had made 2 phone calls to hospitals in Charlotte. She had looked at flights. And then she had sat in her apartment in Busan and looked at the harbor and thought about what it meant to run from a place versus what it meant to leave it, and she had decided that she was done running from things. She had been there for a year. She knew the city. She knew where the good markets were and which bus routes ran late and where to get the fish cake soup that was in fact worth going outside for. She stayed. Her daughter arrived at 6:14 a.m. and weighed 7 pounds and had her mother's hands and a quality of focused attention in her eyes that Zuri noted with the complicated clarity of a woman who had been paying attention to a certain person for over a year was familiar. She named her Mira. She had chosen the name 3 weeks before the birth, and she had not told anyone what it was. Not her mother in Charlotte, who called every Thursday, not her colleagues, not her attorney. She had wanted the name to belong to just the 2 of them for a while before it belonged to anyone else. Do-yoon found out through a message she sent him 2 days after the birth. A photograph. Mira asleep in the hospital bassinet, 7 pounds and focused, and below it, her name is Mira. She has your eyes. I thought you should know. She sent it and then set her phone on the bedside table and looked at her daughter in the bassinet and felt, for the first time in a long time, the specific quality of a moment that wasn't about managing a crisis or executing a plan or surviving someone else's calculation. Just a moment, just a room with 2 people in it and a window and morning light. Her phone buzzed 20 minutes later. She's extraordinary. Thank you for telling me. And then, after a brief pause, how are you? She looked at the message for a long time. It was such a small question. It was also the right question, not what do you need or what can I do or any of the forms of assistance that were also forms of pressure. Just, how are you? Seeing her and not the situation. She typed, I'm okay. Tired. Better than I expected. She sent it. Then, after a moment, she added, she really does have your eyes. The weeks after the birth had their own texture. Recovery, which was slower and more demanding than she had expected, and more demanding than she was willing to admit to most people. Her mother flew in from Charlotte for 3 weeks, which was both genuinely helpful and occasionally requiring levels of patience she had to consciously locate. The legal processes continued their slow grind. Julian sent her a brief professional message acknowledging that the board resolution had effectively separated the prosecution targets from the legitimate companies, and that the outcome was closer to justice and less like obliteration than his original plan would have achieved. He didn't apologize again. She hadn't expected him to. The one apology had been the real one, and they both knew it. So began working again at month 2. Consulting work, the kind she could do from her apartment with Mira in a carrier against her chest and a laptop on the kitchen table. She was good at it. She had always been good at it. The difference now was that she did it with a different relationship to what it meant to be good at something. Not as the primary evidence of her value, which was how she had treated it before, but as a thing she did well that also paid for fish cake soup and diapers, and an apartment with a view of a harbor that she had stopped pretending she wasn't attached to. Do-yoon asked in month 3 if he could meet Mira. She sat with the question for 4 days. She didn't answer it immediately because she had learned in the last year that the decisions you make immediately from a place of emotion are not always the decisions you can live with afterward, and this was too important to make from any place except the clearest one she could access. She thought about who he was before. She thought about the hallway. She thought about the conference room. She thought about a man who surrendered evidence against his own organization to prosecutors, and then waited, actually waited, without pressing for months. And she thought about the specific truth that people can change, and the equally specific truth that you cannot know if they have changed until they have had sufficient opportunity to demonstrate it. And that opportunity requires proximity, and proximity requires a decision. She texted him, Saturday morning, the park near the harbor, the one with the benches facing the water. 10 a.m. He arrived at 9:52. She was already there, Mira in the stroller, a coffee in her hand that she had treated herself to because she had decided that she was allowed to treat herself to things without it requiring justification. He walked up the path toward her, and she watched him come, and she noticed that he walked differently than he used to. Not physically differently. The same economy of movement, the same way of occupying space, but something in the quality of it, the absence of something that had been there before. She identified it slowly, the way you identify things that are defined by their absence, the weight of the organization. 15 years of running something built on fear and violence and the exhausting performance of being the man that kind of organization required. He had set it down, and you could see it in his body that he had set it down. He stopped a few feet from her. He looked at the stroller, then at her. "Hi," he said. "Hi," she said. He looked at Mira. Mira was awake and doing the things she did, where she fixed her eyes on something with an intensity that was frankly slightly disconcerting in a 3-month-old. She fixed them on Do-yoon. He crouched down in front of the stroller and looked at her. He didn't say anything for a moment. He just looked at her with the full attention he gave everything, and Mira looked back at him with the focused seriousness she gave everything. "Hi, Mira," he said, quietly. The specific gentleness of someone being very careful with something new and irreplaceable. Mira stared at him. Then she made the small sound she made, the indeterminate one that might be contentment or digestion or simply existing, and Do-yoon made a sound that was very short and quickly controlled, and that Zuri filed away without comment. He stood up. He looked at Zuri. "Thank you," he said. "Don't thank me," she said. "She's yours too. I'm not doing you a favor." He nodded. He sat down on the bench beside her, leaving a deliberate distance between them that she noted and appreciated. The harbor spread out below them, enormous and moving the way it always moved, in that constant, patient way that predated all of them and would outlast all of them, and had never once adjusted its schedule for human crises. They sat for a while without talking, which was something she had not expected to be possible between them yet, and which turned out to be possible because the need to fill silence was something else she had left behind in the last year somewhere, along with several other habits she hadn't realized she was ready to give up. "Your legal situation," she said eventually. "Moving forward. My attorneys expect a resolution in the next 6 months. Cooperation credit is significant." He paused. "I'll likely avoid prosecution on most of the current accounts, if the cooperation is judged to be sufficiently complete. There will be fines. There will be—" He stopped. "It won't be nothing, but it won't be prison." "Are you still in the organization?" "There is no organization." He said it without drama. The last of the criminal partnerships were terminated in January. The accounts were surrendered. What's left is the legal process. "And you?" "And me." He looked at the harbor. "I have very little compared to what I had. The legitimate companies are yours structurally. I have personal assets that aren't part of the holding structure. A modest amount. Enough." "Enough for what?" He looked at her. "I don't know yet. I'm figuring out what I'm building instead." He said it with a slight pause around those last words, aware that she would recognize them, aware that she would understand he was offering them back to her intentionally. She did recognize them. She let them sit for a moment before she responded. "That's the right question," she said. "Is it?" "Knowing what you're building instead, starting from that." She looked at Mira, who had fallen asleep in the precise sudden way of infants, there and then entirely absent. "It's the right question." He looked at Mira too, the sleeping certainty of her. 7 pounds when she was born, gaining steadily, already a person with opinions about things, even if the opinions were currently limited to temperature and hunger. "I'd like to be here," he said, "for her. I'm not asking for more than that right now, not asking for anything from you, just to be present, if you'll allow it." She had thought about this too. She had thought about it carefully, the way she thought about everything carefully, and she had arrived at the same place she had arrived at regarding the question of proximity and the difference between waiting and pressing. "If you're here," she said, "you're here all the way. Not when it's convenient, not when the legal situation is resolved, not when you've decided you're ready. You show up on Saturdays whether you feel like it or not, because she won't always understand the difference, and because children learn what they live with, not what they're told." "Yes," he said. "And I'm not there yet," she said, "with you. I need you to understand that. What I'm offering is access to your daughter, which you have a right to and which she deserves. What I'm not offering is—" She paused. "The rest. Not yet. Maybe eventually. I don't know, but not yet." "I know," he said. "I'm not asking for the rest." "You're thinking about it." "Yes," he said, without pretending otherwise. "I know," she said. "I'm thinking about it too. That doesn't mean we're there." "No." They sat with that honestly, which was the only way she was willing to sit with anything anymore. Below them, the harbor moved. A container ship worked its way toward the port with the slow, massive patience of something built to carry weight, and Mira slept in her stroller with the total commitment of someone who had decided that this moment required nothing from her, and the city stretched out in both directions doing what cities do, maintaining itself, containing multitudes, running its 10,000 small operations that collectively constituted something too large and alive to hold in any single frame. Zuri held her coffee cup with both hands and felt the warmth of it and looked at the water. She was 33 years old. She was the controlling minority shareholder of a legitimately restructured corporate group that employed people who went to work every day and didn't know how close things had come to being otherwise. She was a mother with 3 months of practice at it and approximately 10,000 hours of practice still required. She was a forensic financial analyst between contracts who had recently acquired a reputation for being complicated, which was accurate, and which she had decided to be unconcerned about. She was a woman who had been called nothing by someone who loved her and had responded by taking his empire, which had not fixed what was broken, but had changed something fundamental about who she understood herself to be. She had not forgotten the hallway. She had not forgiven it in the simple way people sometimes mean when they use that word. The way that means it didn't happen or it didn't matter. She meant it in the harder way. The way that means it happened and it mattered, and she was still here, and she was choosing to be still here. Not because she had decided it was fine, but because she had decided that who she was going to be was more important than what had been done to her. And who she was going to be was someone who looked at the full picture of a person and made deliberate choices about what to do with what she saw. That was different from trust. It was the beginning of the conditions under which trust might eventually become possible. She finished her coffee. She looked at Do-yoon. "Same time next Saturday," she said. He looked at her. Something in his face that was not relief, too complicated and too aware of everything it was built on to be relief. Something more like the recognition of a beginning. "Same time," he said. Below them the harbor ran its patient course, neither of them in control of its direction, neither of them needing to be.